It started like any other ordinary morning. John, a retired Army veteran, steps outside to start his day, only to be hit with shocking sight. 5 massive shipping containers blocking his driveway, trapping his car inside. The quiet, peaceful neighborhood he'd called home for years was suddenly turned into a battleground. But what John didn't know was that this wasn't just an accident. This was a calculated move by the very organization he had trusted, his homeowners association. And what's worse, the HOA had no idea who they were messing with, because John wasn't just a homeowner. He was their landlord. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay tuned to see how one man's fight for his rights turned into a battle that shook the entire community to its core. It was a crisp morning when John, a retired Army officer, walked out to his driveway, preparing for his morning routine. He had a long day ahead, a doctor's appointment he had been waiting for, a few errands, and then some quiet time on his porch, enjoying the peace he'd earned over the years. But as he stepped outside, his heart skipped a beat. There, blocking his driveway, were 5 massive, rusting shipping containers. Each one was bigger than a car, towering over him like a silent threat. His mind raced as he realized his driveway was completely blocked. His car, trapped inside, unable to move. Panic set in, especially since he had a medical appointment in an hour. He dashed his phone, hoping for a solution, but found no messages, no notifications. He looked around, bewildered. The peaceful neighborhood he had spent the last 15 years in had suddenly turned hostile. As he stormed back into his house to call the HOA, Homeowners Association, the weight of the situation began to settle. How could this happen? The HOA had been a familiar, if slightly annoying presence, enforcing rules that seemed petty at times, like a mailbox too blue or a fence that was just an inch too high. But this, blocking his driveway, his personal space, his access to the outside world, was now a battle zone. And this battle wasn't just between a homeowner and an HOA. It was between someone who had spent his life defending his country, his rights, and someone now being denied even the freedom to leave his house. It felt like an invasion. It felt like a betrayal. John knew this wasn't just about 5 shipping containers. This was about respect, personal freedom, and standing up for what was right. It was about dignity. And he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. As John walked the front door, his phone ringing in his hand, he felt a pang in his chest. The HOA had always been there, maintaining the rules of the neighborhood. Sure, they made him uncomfortable at times, but they had been good in their own way. At least they weren't like the ones he had seen in other neighborhoods, ruthless, indifferent. They were just a bunch of people with too much time on their hands. Or so he thought. But as he dialed the HOA office number, his heart sank. Diane, the HOA president, answered with her usual cold cheerfulness, as if she had no idea how enraged he was. "Oh, morning, John. Isn't this a surprise?" Her voice dripped with smug satisfaction that John couldn't stand. He was furious. His car was trapped inside his house, and this woman found it amusing. It was almost as if she enjoyed watching his frustration. Diane explained, with the calm of someone who had authority, that the shipping containers were part of a new community improvement initiative. They were temporary, she claimed. But temporary? John's voice cracked with disbelief. Temporary? For how long? Diane went on to tell him that the containers would be there for months. Months? A shiver ran down John's spine. How could they impose such an inconvenience on him, without prior notice, and with no consideration of his life's plans, his medical appointments, his daily routines? The worst part was, as the conversation dragged on, it became clear that this wasn't a simple mistake. It was a deliberate action by the HOA to push their own agenda, regardless of the people they were affecting. John's heart burned with betrayal. He had trusted them, paid his dues, and followed the rules. Yet, when it mattered, they showed no respect. The deeper hurt came from realizing that the HOA, the organization that had once seemed so harmless, was capable of disrespecting someone who had served his country and made sacrifices for it. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but wasn't just about the containers. It was about what the situation represented, an abuse of power. The HOA had crossed a line, and in doing so, they had taken something from John that could never be replaced. His trust. He wasn't just upset, he felt violated, and it was time for him to do something about it. Days passed, and John found himself tangled in a web of frustration and anger. The shipping containers remained a constant reminder of the HOA's audacity. Every time he stepped outside, there they were, steel walls that stopped him from living his life. He had to make calls to his doctor to explain the situation, and the guilt gnawed at him. His body, worn down from years of service, already felt the strain of his age. The added stress of not being able to move his car for appointments only made it worse. He was starting to feel like he was losing control over his own life. And for someone like John, who had always prided himself on being in control, that feeling was suffocating. One night, as he sat on his porch, staring at the containers, he realized how much this had taken a toll on him. He had fought in wars, faced death, and witnessed horrors many wouldn't even imagine. Yet, this small act of defiance from the HOA, blocking his driveway, was causing him more pain than he had ever experienced. It wasn't the containers. It wasn't even the lost medical appointments. It was the emotional weight of knowing that no one cared. Not even the people who lived in the neighborhood he had helped to shape. His neighbors were either too afraid to speak up or simply indifferent, too comfortable in their own routines to care about what was happening to him. John understood something deeper in that moment. The battle wasn't just for his property. It was for his dignity, his right to live without fear of arbitrary control. He couldn't stand the thought of letting the HOA push him around, but he also didn't want to fight alone. The pain wasn't just physical or logistical. It was deeply emotional. He had always been the one to stand up for others, to defend the underdog. Now, he was the one in need of help, and it hurt to ask. The turning point came when John decided he couldn't just sit there, passively let his life be dictated by an organization that cared nothing for his needs or his past. After all, he had served in the military for decades, fought in battles for freedom, and never backed down from a fight when it was for something worthwhile. Why should he let a petty HOA rob him of his dignity now? The decision to stand up wasn't easy, but it was necessary. He remembered something his old sergeant had once told him. Stand up for what's right, even if it's just you standing there. And so, John began to gather evidence, going through the HOA's bylaws, looking for a way to expose their wrongdoings. He didn't have much left in terms of energy, but he still had his wits and his resolve. What he uncovered was more than he expected. The HOA's actions were in violation of local laws. They had no right to block his driveway or access. But beyond the legalities, John realized that this wasn't just about the rules. It was about respect. The HOA had shown him none. They had assumed they could intimidate him into compliance, relying on their power. But John wasn't going to let that happen. As he prepared to take the next steps, he felt a spark of hope. He wasn't fighting for just his own space anymore. He was fighting for the integrity of the entire neighborhood, for a sense of fairness that had been lost somewhere along the way. This fight wasn't about shipping containers or petty rules. It was about dignity. And John would defend his dignity with everything he had left. As John began his investigation into the HOA's actions, he reached out to his old friend Mark, a fellow veteran who had retired in the same neighborhood. Mark was a quiet, thoughtful man, but when he spoke, people listened. Over the years, their bond had deepened, as they shared stories of their past military experiences. They'd both faced battles, but none had prepared them for the emotional warfare that was about to unfold. When John explained the situation, Mark's expression hardened. "This is personal," he said, his voice low. "They've messed with the wrong guy." Mark didn't hesitate. He dove into the HOA's history, pulling up records and documents that John hadn't even considered. What they found shook them both. The HOA had been involved in shady dealings for years. They had manipulated rules, turned a blind eye to violations when it suited them, and used their power to intimidate the community. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. John and Mark realized they weren't just fighting for their own peace of mind. They were fighting for the future of the neighborhood. Mark's sharp mind and John's determination created a powerful team, one that would go to any lengths to ensure that no one, not even the HOA, could bully their way through life. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. And now, John had the support he needed, his old friend, a trusted ally who understood the true cause of standing up for what was right. Together, they were ready to take the fight to the HOA, armed with the truth and the strength of their friendship. As John began to strategize his next move, he noticed a subtle shift in the neighborhood. His struggle was no longer just his own. It had become a shared concern. At first, he felt alone, isolated in his fight against the HOA. But little by little, a few of his neighbors started to take notice. Mrs. Peterson, a retired schoolteacher, had always been a quiet type, the one who rarely spoke up at HOA meetings. She was the type to smile at everyone, but her true thoughts were often hidden behind that friendly exterior. One evening, as John stood in his yard, staring at the containers, Mrs. Peterson approached him. "You know, I've been here for 30 years, she said softly, "and I've never seen anything like this." Her voice carried an unmistakable sincerity. "I've lived through the good times and bad with the HOA, but this is different. This is wrong." For the first time, John realized that this wasn't just an issue about his property, his driveway. This was about the heart of the neighborhood, about the spirit of fairness and respect that had once defined the community. Mrs. Peterson wasn't alone. Quietly, others started coming forward, sharing their own frustrations with the HOA, about unreasonable fines, about rules that seemed to target the elderly, the ones who could least afford it. The group of supporters grew, slowly at first, but then more boldly. The truth was, many of them had silently suffered for years under the HOA's power, but now they saw a chance to stand up together. This wasn't just one man's fight. It was a fight of a community, a fight that would reclaim their voices and their dignity. The emotional power of community support couldn't be overstated. John was no longer fighting in isolation. As he met with more and more neighbors, he felt an overwhelming sense of solidarity. They shared their stories, vented their frustrations, and formed bonds that hadn't existed before. In the midst of all the tension, John could feel something new growing. Hope. He realized that this wasn't just about confronting the HOA. It was about restoring the neighborhood to what it used to be, a place where everyone had a say, where neighbors helped one another, and where respect was the foundation. This was bigger than the shipping containers. It was about the community fighting to take back control of their own lives. John knew that the key to winning this battle lay in exposing the truth about the HOA. But as he dug deeper into their records, what he found shocked him. The HOA had a long history of shady behavior, using its power to manipulate residents and make decisions that weren't in the best interests of the community. There were whispers of past scandals, of fines levied for the most trivial things, of rule changes that seemed to appear out of nowhere, and of financial dealings that were anything but transparent. But what really sent a chill down John's spine was what he found about their financial dealings. The HOA had been involved in questionable contracts with local businesses, and one of those contracts had raised a flag. They had entered into a lease agreement with a shipping company, one that provided substantial financial support for the HOA's improvement projects. However, this wasn't an ordinary business deal. It was a deal that put the HOA's interests above the needs of the people they were meant to serve. Digging deeper, John discovered that this shipping company, Lloyd Trans, had been paying the HOA handsomely to store containers on the property. And to John's shock, the shipping containers that had been placed in front of his house weren't just a temporary inconvenience. They were part of a financial arrangement that benefited the HOA board members. This revelation was more than just infuriating. It was personal. John realized that the HOA wasn't just abusing its power. They were putting their own financial gain ahead of the well-being of the people who lived in the neighborhood. The containers blocking his driveway weren't about community improvement. They were about greed. This discovery gave John more than just ammunition. It gave him leverage. Armed with this knowledge, he wasn't going to let the HOA's past actions remain hidden. He was going to make sure everyone knew the truth. And he wasn't going to back down until the injustice was exposed for all to see. The emotional toll this betrayal had on John was immense. He had spent years contributing to this community, believing that the HOA was working for the good of the residents. To find out that they had been prioritizing their own gain over the well-being of the very people they were supposed to serve was heartbreaking. But it was also the fuel he needed to keep going. John had always been the underdog, a man who had learned to fight for what he believed in, even when the odds were stacked against him. He was used to being underestimated. But that never stopped him. In the military, he had faced down impossible odds and walked away victorious. Now, as he stood in his driveway, staring at the shipping containers, he knew that this was yet another battle that he couldn't afford to lose. His age and health had made him feel vulnerable in ways he hadn't anticipated. But there was still one thing he had that the HOA didn't: determination. The fire inside him had been reignited, and he was ready to fight back. As he walked through the neighborhood, talking to his neighbors and sharing his findings about the HOA's financial dealings, he could see the same underdog spirit stirring in them as well. The more he spoke, the more they rallied behind him. People who had once been afraid to speak up began to find their voices. The idea that they could stand up to the HOA, that they could take back control of their community, started to take root. John wasn't just fighting for his property anymore. He was fighting for their rights, for their dignity, and for the future of the neighborhood they had all worked so hard to build. The underdog spirit was infectious. It spread like wildfire, igniting a passion in John's neighbors that hadn't been there before. Together, they made a commitment. They wouldn't let the HOA bully them any longer. They would stand together, shoulder to shoulder, and demand respect. It wasn't going to be easy, and they knew they had a tough road ahead, but they also knew that if they didn't fight, they would lose not just their homes, but their sense of community. And that was something none of them were willing to let go of. As John continued his campaign to expose the HOA's wrongdoings, he began to realize something powerful: the power of empathy. He was no longer just talking about rules and bylaws. He was talking about people's lives. The more he listened to his neighbors, the more he understood the emotional toll that the HOA's actions had taken on them. Mrs. Patel, a quiet, elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, confided in John one evening. "I've never been one to cause trouble," she said softly, "but they've been so unfair. They've made my life miserable with these fines. They fine me for having too many flowers in my garden, for goodness sake." Her voice quivered with the weight of years of frustration. John listened carefully, realizing that this wasn't just about him. It was about the silent struggles that his neighbors had endured for years. The more stories John heard, the more he realized that the HOA's actions were part of a larger pattern of manipulation and control. People were afraid to speak out because they feared retaliation, fines, violations, or worse, being ostracized from the community. But as John shared his plans and his findings with others, he saw a spark of hope in their eyes. They began to realize that they didn't have to suffer in silence anymore. They didn't have to let fear control them. Together, they could fight back. And it wasn't just about winning. It was about standing up for each other. It was about showing that they cared about each other's struggles, that they wouldn't let the HOA break them. Empathy wasn't just a feeling. It was a weapon. And together, they were using it to create a sense of solidarity that was unstoppable. By now, John knew that this battle wasn't going to be won through brute force. He wasn't about to pick a fight that would drag on for months or years, turning his life into a never-ending cycle of conflict. Instead, he would fight the HOA with his mind, using his knowledge, his wits, and his determination to outsmart them. The shipping containers weren't just an inconvenience. They were a symbol of everything that was wrong with the HOA. John wasn't just going to sit back and let them take what was rightfully his. He had learned in his years of service that the best way to defeat an enemy was to outthink them. The more he researched, the more he uncovered loopholes in the HOA's actions. He found legal precedents that proved the HOA's decisions were in violation of property rights. He dug into their financial records, uncovering the hidden deals that had led to the container placement. Armed with this knowledge, he was ready to take the fight to the next level. It wasn't just about taking containers down. It was about showing the HOA that they couldn't bully him or anyone else anymore. In the upcoming HOA meeting, John planned to present all his findings in a calm, calculated manner. He knew that the HOA board members would try to dismiss him, to undermine his evidence, but he was prepared. He had done his homework. He had the facts, and he wasn't afraid to use them. The real battle, he knew, wasn't about who had the loudest voice. It was about who had the best argument, the most compelling case, and he was ready to win. Just when John thought things couldn't get any more complicated, he received an unexpected blow. His phone buzzed with a message from his lawyer. "Samantha, check your email. Something big has come through. John's heart raced as he opened the email, only to find a shocking revelation. The HOA wasn't just inconveniencing him for no reason. They were actually trying to force him out of his home. The message from the HOA was direct and chilling. They wanted him to sell his house, and they were willing to make a financial nightmare if he refused. John stood frozen in his living room. He had been preparing for a legal battle over the driveway blockade, but now the stakes had gotten higher. This wasn't just about petty fines or a misplaced shipping container anymore. It was about the HOA trying to take away his home. They had crossed a line that was unforgivable. This wasn't just about property rights. It was about power, control, and intimidation. The emotional impact hit him like a punch to the gut. His home, the place where he had built a life, raised his children, and now hoped to spend his final years in peace, was being threatened. As the anger welled up inside him, John realized that this wasn't just about fighting for his driveway anymore. This was about standing up for his dignity, his legacy, and his right to live in peace. And he wasn't going to let anyone, especially an overreaching HOA, take that from him. The battle had escalated, but so had his determination. He wasn't going to be intimidated or bullied. This was no longer just a legal matter. It was a fight for his freedom. He could feel the weight of the decision ahead, but he was ready. The gloves were off, and the war had just begun. Word spread quickly about John's escalating battle with the HOA, and something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors, once afraid to speak out, began to rally behind him. People who had kept their heads down for years, avoiding confrontation, now found the courage to step up. They started coming to John's door, offering their support, sharing their own frustrations with the HOA. They had seen what had happened to John, and they knew they were next. They could no longer remain silent while the HOA trampled on their rights. The power of community support was undeniable. John realized that this wasn't just his fight. It was a fight of everyone who had been wronged by the HOA over the years. People began to share their own stories. Stories of excessive fines, arbitrary rule enforcement, and a constant feeling of being watched. Slowly, the residents started to realize that they were stronger together. The truth was, the HOA had been using fear to maintain control. But now, that fear was being replaced by a shared sense of injustice. And with that came the courage to fight back. It wasn't just about taking down the shipping containers anymore. It was about empowering the people who had been living in fear, making them realize that they didn't have to put up with the HOA's tactics. As John spoke with more of his neighbors, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than just a personal battle. This was about bringing fairness and justice back to their community. The HOA had tried to divide them, to break their spirits, but John and his neighbors were proving that unity was a far stronger force. John knew that the best way to win this fight wasn't through brute force or a loud confrontation. It was through careful strategy, patience, and intelligence. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the HOA had underestimated him. They thought they could push him around because of his age, his health, and his quiet nature. But what they didn't realize was that John was a man who had spent years outthinking his enemies, who had learned how to navigate difficult situations with finesse. He wasn't going to rush in with a sword drawn. He was going to outsmart them. John began to dig into the HOA's history, their contracts, their legal dealings, and their financial records. Every time he found a flaw, a mistake, or a loophole, he documented it. He spoke with lawyers, real estate experts, and even former HOA members who had left the organization in disgust. It became clear that the HOA had been running on shaky ground for a long time. They had gotten away with it because no one had dared to challenge them. Until now, John's lawyer, Samantha, was impressed with the depth of his research. Together, they pieced together a strategy that would not only expose the HOA's illegal actions, but also force them to back down. The battle of which was on. John knew that the HOA's board would fight tooth and nail to protect their interests, but he also knew that the truth was on his side. As he prepared for the next meeting, he didn't feel nervous. He felt confident. He had the facts, and he knew how to present them. This fight wasn't about noise or chaos. It was about precision, and John was ready to make his move. As John's legal team worked on the case, they uncovered something crucial that could turn the tide in his favor. The HOA had been using a clause in their governing documents to justify their actions. claiming that the containers were part of a community improvement initiative. However, this clause was vague and poorly defined, and it was clear that the HOA was exploiting it for their own benefit. After consulting with legal experts, Samantha discovered that the clause the HOA was relying on didn't even apply to the situation at hand. In fact, it had never been properly enforced in the first place. This was the break John had been waiting for. Armed with this new knowledge, he began to piece together a legal argument that would expose the HOA's overreach. But there was more. As they dug into the HOA's past practices, they discovered that the organization had a long history of making decisions without proper legal authority. They had been operating without the necessary permits, without the proper votes, and without transparency. This wasn't just about the shipping containers. It was about a pattern of misconduct that spanned years. The more John learned, the more determined he became to bring the HOA's actions to light. With this new legal leverage, John felt more empowered than ever. He wasn't just fighting for his driveway anymore. He was fighting to expose an organization that had been abusing its power for far too long. The lessons were clear. Never assume that rules are set in stone, and always question authority when something doesn't feel right. John had learned to navigate the system, to understand the intricacies of legal documents, and to fight for what was just. It was a hard lesson, but it was one that would pay off in the end. As the battle the HOA raged on, John couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the community that had rallied around him. At first, it had felt like he was fighting alone. But now, the neighborhood had come together in a way that John hadn't thought possible. It was more than just a legal fight. It was a fight for the soul of the community. The HOA had tried to divide them, to make them fear one another. But instead, it had united them in a common cause. John watched as his neighbors, once timid and afraid, began to speak up. Mrs. Patel, the kind-hearted woman who had been so hesitant to get involved, stood at the front of the next HOA meeting, passionately defending the rights of all homeowners. Marcus, a young man who had recently moved in, shared his own experiences with the HOA's unreasonable fines. People who had never spoken out before were now standing together, sharing their stories and supporting each other. It was a beautiful sight. This wasn't just about the shipping containers. It was about taking back control of their lives, their neighborhood, and their community. The residents of Pinecrest Gardens had learned a powerful lesson. Together, they could face down any challenge, no matter how big or small. They had been intimidated for too long, but now they were standing tall, ready to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. The power of community was undeniable, and it was something that the HOA could never take away. As the battle with the HOA escalated, John began to feel the weight of his fight. It wasn't just about removing the shipping containers. It was about showing the HOA that their actions had consequences. And those consequences were now beginning to catch up with them. After months of tension and legal wrangling, the HOA board started to backpedal. The media attention, the pressure from the community, and the undeniable legal flaws in their actions were too much to ignore. John could sense that they were starting to crumble under the pressure. It was the first sign that the HOA was no longer in control. The board members, once so confident and smug in their authority, were now acting like cornered animals. At the next community meeting, Diane, the HOA president, seemed more jittery than usual. Richard and Karen, who had been the staunchest supporters of the containers, now kept glancing nervously at John. The power dynamics had shifted, and they knew it. For the first time in this long ordeal, John could feel that victory was within reach. It wasn't just about the legal battles anymore. It was about the psychological toll he had taken on them. They were losing their grip, and John was gaining ground. The emotional relief for John was palpable. He could see it in the faces of his neighbors. They had all fought so hard for this moment. The fear that had gripped the community for so long was beginning to dissipate. The shift in power was more than just symbolic. It was real. The HOA's attempt to bully and control had failed. And as the container slowly started to be removed, John knew that he had accomplished something much greater than just winning a small legal victory. He had shown his community that they could stand up to injustice, that they could take back control of their neighborhood. This was more than a personal triumph. It was a victory for everyone who had been too afraid to speak up before. The suspense was building as a final showdown between John and the HOA approached. This wasn't just going to be another HOA meeting. It was going to be a confrontation, a battle for the future of the neighborhood. John had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He had gathered evidence, enlisted legal help, and most importantly, he had the support of his neighbors. The HOA had underestimated the power of a united community, and now they were about to face the consequences. The meeting was packed. Neighbors who had once been too intimidated to speak were now at the front, eager to share their experiences. John stood at the back, watching as the HOA board members fidgeted nervously. Diane, who had once exuded confidence, was now on edge. Richard and Karen were whispering to each other, their faces pale. The tension in the room was thick, and John could feel it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. When it was finally his turn to speak, John walked to the front of the room, his steps steady and sure. He didn't raise his voice, but the calm authority in his tone was undeniable. He presented his evidence, documents, photos, legal findings, that exposed the HOA's illegal actions. As he spoke, he could see the shock on the board members' faces. They knew they had lost. The room was silent as John laid out the facts. There was no denying it anymore. The power was no longer in their hands. For the first time, John realized that he wasn't just fighting for his rights. He was fighting for the rights of everyone who had ever been oppressed by the HOA. This wasn't just about him. It was about justice. The suspense of the moment was electric. Everyone in the room, even those who had been supportive of the HOA, could feel the shift. This wasn't just about winning a small battle. It was about the community standing up and saying no to the abuse of power. And as the meeting drew to a close, John knew that this was a turning point. The HOA could no longer hide behind their rules or their arrogance. The people had spoken. After months of fighting, the final moment arrived. The containers that had once blocked John's driveway, that had symbolized the HOA's power over him, were finally being removed. The emotional high that John felt in that moment was indescribable. He stood at the edge of his property, watching as the heavy machinery lifted the shipping containers off his driveway, revealing his garage for the first time in weeks. He could hardly believe it. After everything he had been through, the pain, the frustration, the sleepless nights, this moment of triumph felt almost surreal. But it wasn't just the physical removal of the containers that brought John joy. It was the realization that he had fought for something much bigger than himself. He had fought for his dignity, for his right to live without fear of arbitrary control. And he had won. The emotional toll of the battle had been immense, but the victory was sweet. He had stood his ground, refused to back down, and in the end it had paid off. As the containers were hauled away, neighbors came out to cheer, clapping and applauding. John felt a lump in his throat as he saw the joy in their eyes. They weren't just celebrating the removal of the containers. They were celebrating the fact that they had stood up together and won. The sense of unity in the neighborhood had never been stronger. For John, it was a moment of pure, unfiltered emotion. He had fought for the right to be treated fairly, and he had won. The emotional relief was overwhelming, but it was also a reminder of the power of persistence, of standing firm in the face of adversity. The victory over the HOA had far-reaching consequences, and its impact was felt long after the containers were removed. The battle had not only changed John's life, but had transformed the entire community. Neighbors who had once lived in fear of the HOA now realized that they had a voice. They had the power to make a difference. The victory had sparked a wave of change, one that would continue to resonate for years to come. The HOA, once impressive force in the neighborhood, was forced to reevaluate its actions. They had been exposed to their manipulation, their lack of transparency, and their disregard for the people they were meant to serve. The community's victory was a powerful reminder that people, when united, could stand up against even the most powerful of organizations. For John, the impact was deeply personal. He had reclaimed his dignity, his home, and his peace of mind. But more than that, he had shown his neighbors that they didn't have to accept injustice. They didn't have to live in fear. The battle had been hard, but it had brought the community closer together. And now, the real work began. John wasn't just focused on his own victory anymore. He was focused on helping his neighbors protect their rights and build a better future for everyone. As the dust settled and the community moved forward, John reflected on the lessons he he had learned throughout this journey. The battle had been long and difficult, but it had taught him valuable lessons about perseverance, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. In the face of overwhelming odds, John had never given up. Even when it seemed like the HOA's power was unbeatable, he had held firm. And in the end, it was that unwavering determination that led to his victory. John's story became a symbol of hope for others who were facing their own battles, whether against a powerful organization or just the struggles of everyday life. He had learned that no matter how old you are, no matter what obstacles you face, perseverance can change the course of your life. It wasn't just about winning. It was about never backing down, about finding the strength to keep going even when things seemed impossible. The lesson was clear. Never underestimate the power of determination. Never give up on what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. And most importantly, never let anyone take away your dignity or your voice. John had learned that lesson the hard way, but in the end, it was a lesson that had brought him and his community the greatest victory.